Calvin Reeve learned the shape of waiting the way some men learned prayer, by repeating it until it felt like control. The airport wasn't one building so much as a collection of rooms that never ended. LAX stretched into the night with fluorescent lights that hummed like they resented sleep, and announcements that always sounded too cheerful for the way everyone's body sagged with delay. He sat where the seats were supposed to be temporary, tucked near a row of outlets, close enough to charge his phone, far enough that strangers didn't feel obligated to make conversation. His carry-on was at his feet like a loyal dog, present, quiet, refusing to ask him for anything. Every few minutes he checked his gate status again, even though it never changed. The little spinning circle on the app felt like a joke with no punchline. On his left hand, a thin indentation remained where his wedding ring used to sit. Not the ring itself. He had sold it, donated it, wrapped it in a box like he could pack away the past and still breathe. But his skin remembered. His knuckles remembered. When he flexed his fingers, he sometimes caught the ghost pressure as if someone else's promise was still there, still warm. He hadn't allowed feeling into his life since the funeral. Not even the small, harmless kind. Not even the kind you could pretend was just relief when it arrived in waves after grief exhausted itself. After the last time his chest had collapsed in the middle of the kitchen, he'd told himself it was safer to be numb. Numb didn't break. Numb didn't leave. Numb stayed put. The trouble with airports was that they insisted on movement. People flowed around him in tides, luggage wheels clicking, shoes scuffing, someone laughing too loud near the snack stand. Their voices bounced off the ceiling and came back softened, like the building itself tried to be kinder than it was. Calvin watched all of it with the careful detachment of a man standing behind glass. He could see the world, sure. He just refused to touch it. The delay announcement repeated for the third time. "We apologize for the inconvenience." It was always the same phrase, and yet each time it landed like fresh disappointment. He closed his eyes for a second and counted to 5. When he opened them again, the woman beside him was gone. In her place, half an hour later, as if the universe had decided to rearrange the theater, sat Miguel Santos. Miguel looked like he belonged in a different movie. He was dressed in a clean, dark jacket that didn't scream airport practicality, and his hair, as thick as it was obedient, fell into neat lines that didn't match the chaos of travel. His posture was open but not careless, like he'd spent years learning how to be comfortable without inviting strangers to assume too much. Calvin recognized the type. Someone who didn't do small talk because they didn't need it. Someone who observed and then chose, consciously, when to speak. Miguel's phone glowed in his hand. He stared at it, thumb hovering, then tucked it away like he'd remembered not to hope. Calvin should have kept his eyes down, but his attention slid, against his will, toward the way Miguel's knee bounced rhythmically, an almost hidden impatience that didn't quite fit the calm expression. A few minutes later, the lights flickered slightly. A wave of movement rippled down the rows. More staff walking past, more passengers shifting like the air itself had thickened. Calvin felt the vibration in his bones even before his ears processed it. Miguel leaned slightly toward the outlet strip, adjusting his bag. He had the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate. Calvin heard him swallow. Then Miguel reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of gum. He didn't offer it. He just pressed it once between his fingers, as if grounding himself. Calvin's own phone buzzed. Another gate update with nothing he wanted. He stared at it until the screen dimmed. A couple seats away, Darren Wilcox, older, broad-shouldered, a man who looked like he could lift a box without needing help, stood up and stretched his arms. Darren's eyes drifted across the area and landed on Calvin. A second later, Darren looked away as if he'd caught himself watching. Miguel noticed the same glance. Calvin saw it in the way Miguel's eyes lifted briefly, then returned to the screen. For a moment, Calvin wondered if Miguel was just as careful about other people's perceptions as he was about his own pain. It was a small, quiet guess, one he didn't want to become a thought. Then the airport announced another delay. Calvin's chest tightened again. He realized he'd been holding his breath without meaning to. He exhaled slowly, the air tasting like cold coffee from the vending machine nearby. Miguel shifted his seat, closer. Not enough to be a violation, but enough to change the distance between their worlds. Calvin felt the shift like a draft. Miguel's voice was low when he spoke, directed more at the air than at Calvin. They're going to push it again. Calvin blinked. He hadn't planned on replying to anyone. His instinct was to let the words fall and vanish. But Miguel's tone didn't ask for agreement. It sounded like he was reporting the weather. Calvin let his voice come out gently, like he didn't want to startle the fragile calm inside himself. Yeah. Miguel nodded, as if that one syllable was all he'd expected. Calvin's phone buzzed again. Another message request, someone trying to confirm a ride. He didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could handle any more human needs. Miguel reached for his charger cable and plugged it in. The phone began to refill with energy while everyone around them drained it. Calvin watched without meaning to. Then, without drama, without the kind of flirtation that belonged on a screen, Miguel let his gaze slide toward Calvin's hands. Not his face, not his posture, his hands. Calvin felt a heat flare at his skin. It was absurd, like being embarrassed by your own heartbeat. He tucked his hands closer to his body. Miguel's eyes flicked away quickly, but not before Calvin saw the brief expression there. Recognition, maybe. Not pity, something else. Something that didn't ask questions and still somehow understood. Calvin's throat tightened. He wanted to believe it was nothing. Airports were full of random coincidences. People looked at hands all the time. Still, his mind started to play the memory games it always avoided. His wife's fingers interlaced with his, her ring tapping lightly against his knuckle when she laughed. The way her hand had felt warm, always warm, even in cold rooms. Calvin forced those images down like pressing a lid over boiling water. Miguel cleared his throat. He didn't look directly at Calvin when he spoke again. You're waiting alone. Calvin stared at the floor for a second, searching for a lie that wouldn't demand emotion. Yeah, it was the truth, which meant it should have felt neutral. Instead, it felt like ripping tape off his skin. Miguel hummed, as if considering something. I'm not, he said, and then seemed to realize how that sounded. He added, I mean, my brother's coming, or he said he would. He's not always good at being on time. Calvin listened, not because he cared about brothers, but because Miguel said it like he'd practiced telling the story without sounding bitter. He wondered what Miguel's practiced versions looked like. He wondered how many rehearsals a man needed before he could say what he was feeling without breaking. Miguel shifted again, and the shoulder of his jacket brushed the edge of Calvin's bag. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't intimate either. It was just proximity, an acknowledgement of shared space. Calvin's body reacted anyway. His skin felt too aware. His muscles tightened. He hated that he still responded like a living thing. They sat in quiet, the airport's noise washing over them in layers. Occasionally, someone passed between them, and Calvin caught glimpses of faces, tired, sharp, anxious, hungry. People were always hungry, even when they pretended it was for something else. Miguel reached for his phone again. His thumb hovered. Calvin could see the cursor blinking in a message draft without being able to read the words. Then, to Calvin's surprise, Miguel's screen went dark, and he looked up. Not at the departure board, not at the vending machines. At Calvin. Miguel's mouth moved before his mind decided what to do. Do you ever talk to strangers when you're stuck somewhere? Calvin felt his own instinct answer first. No, never. It was too dangerous. Strangers could turn into questions. But Miguel's voice didn't sound demanding. It sounded like curiosity from a man who had spent years acting sure of himself until something cracked. Calvin swallowed. Sometimes, he lied, because it felt safer than admitting he didn't. Miguel smiled faintly, not quite amusement, not quite disappointment. I'm Miguel, he said. Calvin had the sudden urge to be honest about everything, to tell Miguel the truth about the ring indentation, the funeral, The way his days had been reduced to tasks because tasks didn't require hope. He didn't. He just said, "Calvin." Miguel nodded. "Calvin." He said the name like he was tasting it. Then he looked away again like he wasn't sure he deserved to have it in his mouth. For a while, they watched the delay stretch. Calvin's mind tried to keep itself occupied. He counted the rows, noticed the color of the carpet fibers, estimated the time until the next announcement. Miguel didn't distract him. He didn't fill the silence with performative kindness. Instead, he seemed to practice patience with the world. And Calvin, unwilling, slow, started to recognize how rare that was. The terminal got colder after midnight. Or maybe Calvin had simply started feeling the chill of the dark more sharply. A few seats down, Darren Wilcox finally sat back down. Darren's gaze landed on Miguel for longer than it should have. Calvin noticed because he always noticed. He'd trained himself to observe danger. Grief had been dangerous. It had taught him to scan. Darren adjusted the strap of his bag and then looked toward Calvin as if deciding whether to approach. He stood up again, then paused. Miguel's eyes tracked Darren's movement. Calvin could see the tension in Miguel's jaw. Before Darren could move closer, Miguel lifted one hand, not waving, not stopping him, just signaling. Darren seemed to hesitate, then lowered himself back into his seat. Calvin watched Darren exhale like he'd been holding breath for a decision. Miguel turned back to Calvin. "He's trying," Miguel said quietly, as if Calvin and Darren were both part of a small problem only they could understand. Calvin frowned slightly. "Trying at what?" Miguel's eyes didn't quite meet Calvin's. "To be brave," he said. Then after a beat, "or to pretend he doesn't need bravery." Calvin's stomach twisted. The words weren't about Darren alone. Calvin could feel that. He turned his gaze toward the departure board again. Gate numbers swirled like changing tides. His phone buzzed with another update. This time, the message wasn't just airport-related. It was from his brother-in-law's old contact list, someone he hadn't talked to in months. Calvin stared at the name on the screen. He didn't open it. The brightness felt invasive. Miguel noticed. He didn't ask. He just shifted his body so the light of Calvin's screen wasn't directly in his eyes anymore. A subtle move. A quiet courtesy. Calvin's throat burned. He told himself it was nothing. Men did that kind of thing all the time. But not like Miguel did. Not like it meant something. Minutes later, Miguel's phone lit up again. He glanced at it and his eyebrows lifted in surprise. Then he laughed once, short and breathy, like he hadn't heard joy in a while. "He said he's actually coming," Miguel murmured. Calvin felt relief surge in him for a stranger, which made him hate himself a little. Why did he care? Why did he react? He wasn't allowed to react. Miguel typed something quickly. The sound of his thumbs tapping the glass felt too intimate in the quiet of midnight. Calvin's own phone buzzed again, and this time the message was from Miguel. Miguel held the phone up just slightly, as if asking permission to show it. Calvin's heart stuttered. Calvin had never given Miguel his number, not openly. Calvin's fingers went cold. "I didn't," he started. Miguel shook his head quickly. "No, you're right. I didn't have it." His voice softened. "But you looked at my charger and your phone's been dying. So I asked the desk for the Wi-Fi and He cut himself off, embarrassed, and looked away. "You were staring at your screen like it was going to explode. I thought I'd help." Calvin blinked. The airport Wi-Fi was a maze. He hadn't realized Miguel might have been navigating it for him. Miguel turned the screen so Calvin could see the chat. There was a draft there, a message already typed. It was the kind of message you only wrote when you weren't sure you'd ever get to send it. Calvin's eyes caught the words and his breath snagged. "What's this?" Calvin asked, too quietly. Miguel's smile disappeared. "It's nothing," he said too fast. Calvin looked at the text again. "It says, 'You up?'" Miguel's face went still. "Yeah," he admitted. "I sent it to someone else earlier. It wasn't for you." But the truth didn't soothe Calvin. The truth didn't erase the feeling under it. Calvin's brain, always searching for patterns, wondered why Miguel had typed those words, why that phrase lived in his fingers. Miguel watched Calvin with a careful, controlled expression. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have showed it like that. His voice trailed. Calvin forced himself to speak. "Who were you texting?" Miguel hesitated. The pause felt like a door that might open or might slam. "A friend," Miguel said. Then, as if the lie had weight, he swallowed. "A guy, a straight friend," he added quickly, as though the word could protect him from consequences. Calvin's mouth went dry. Miguel continued, his voice lower now. "We grew up together. Miguel broke off, gaze drifting to the floor like he couldn't bear to keep meeting Calvin's eyes. "He thinks I'm normal. Like I want things that don't make me feel complicated." Calvin didn't know what to do with that. He'd spent so long believing he could keep his feelings locked behind careful habits that he didn't know how to respond when someone else admitted their own complicated truth. He heard Darren shift behind them. The sound was small. The tension in Calvin's body wasn't. Calvin turned slightly to look at Darren. Darren had his head tilted down, eyes fixed on his own phone. But Calvin could feel the way Darren was listening anyway. Miguel noticed Calvin's glance. He stiffened in a way that didn't match his casual tone. A new announcement crackled through the speakers. Boarding was delayed again, now for longer. The words blurred behind Calvin's ears. Miguel exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since he started speaking. "I don't know what I'm doing," he confessed quietly. The honesty in his voice made Calvin's chest ache. Calvin thought about his wife again, about the ring indentation, about how he'd stopped living because he believed living would betray her memory. He looked at Miguel's hands. There wasn't a ring there, no visible promise. Just a man trying to keep himself from falling into something he might not survive. Calvin's voice came out softer than he intended. "Feeling complicated doesn't mean you're wrong," he said. Miguel stared at him. Calvin realized he'd said too much. He hadn't meant to. It wasn't his job to soothe Miguel. It wasn't his place to give him permission. Miguel's eyes flicked to Calvin's left hand. Calvin tensed again, but Miguel didn't reach for him. He didn't invade space. He just nodded slowly. "You know," Miguel said, like the words were arriving from somewhere deep, "you really know." Calvin tried to swallow the sudden lump in his throat. His body wanted to confess in the same way Miguel had. Not because it was romantic, not because it was dramatic, but because the world kept pressing him toward honesty until he couldn't keep his silence intact. He looked down at his phone and finally opened the message he'd been avoiding. It was from his brother-in-law, a short text about how he was sorry for Calvin's loss and how the funeral anniversary was coming up. Sorry. Always sorry. Calvin stared at it until the letters looked like they belonged to someone else. Miguel watched Calvin's face shift. When Calvin finally lifted his gaze, Miguel was watching him with a kind of patience Calvin didn't know how to earn. Calvin spoke carefully. "My wife died," he said. The words felt like tearing paper, not loud tearing, slow tearing. Miguel didn't flinch. He only softened, his shoulders dropping as if something in him had been bracing for impact. Calvin continued because once you started telling the truth, the silence became unbearable. "I haven't let myself want anything since. Not even good things. I tell myself it's respect." Miguel's eyes shone faintly. He blinked fast like he was trying to keep control. Calvin hated the wetness in his voice. "But sometimes," he admitted, "it feels like I'm punishing myself." Miguel's throat moved. "Yeah," he whispered. "That's exactly it." Calvin blinked. He hadn't expected Miguel to understand. Not so precisely. The airport noise swelled and then receded again. Calvin couldn't tell if it was the speakers or his own blood rushing in his ears. Miguel shifted closer, not crowding, but giving Calvin more space to speak to him without feeling hunted. "I haven't told anyone I want men," Miguel said suddenly. Calvin froze. Miguel looked frightened after saying it, like he'd thrown a glass and now watched it shatter. Calvin's first instinct was to step away from the intensity, but he didn't. He simply stayed still and listened. Miguel rushed his next words as if speed might fix their impact. I don't do labels in the ways people expect. I've dated women. I've loved them. I can be a good person. I can be a good partner. He swallowed hard. But when I'm alone, I think about... He stopped. Calvin waited, even though waiting hurt. Miguel's gaze moved to the floor again. I think about how easy it is to breathe around the right kind of person. And I hate myself for wanting it because it feels like betrayal. Calvin felt something inside him loosen. Not mend, not heal. Loosening, like a knot letting go one thread at a time. He imagined his own grief telling him similar lies. That happiness would betray his wife. That wanting anything would mean he didn't love her enough. He understood Miguel because the shape of their fear was the same. The difference was that Miguel was choosing to say it out loud. Calvin had stayed silent so long that his silence felt like identity. Calvin's voice turned careful again. When did you start thinking you had to be honest? He asked. Miguel let out a shaky breath. Tonight, he said, and the word landed heavier than it should have. Calvin waited. Miguel's eyes met his again. When I sat down, he continued, I thought I'd just be polite. I thought I'd keep my hands to myself. I thought... He stopped, like he couldn't finish without risking everything. But then you looked at your ring indentation like it was still there. And I thought, if I don't speak now, I'll spend the rest of my life pretending I can handle the silence. Calvin's chest ached at the precision of that fear. He didn't trust himself to respond with anything noble. He responded with something human. I've spent years pretending, he admitted. And it didn't make me strong. It just made me empty. Miguel's face softened into something almost relieved. Then, across the rows, Darren Wilcox stood up again. He was moving like a man who'd finally stopped asking permission. Calvin saw it immediately. Darren's gaze was fixed on Miguel, and his expression was tight, fear threaded through determination. Miguel tensed, his body shifting as if he'd prepared for impact. He's here, Miguel said under his breath. Calvin turned his head just enough to see Darren's approach. Darren paused a respectful distance away. Miguel, Darren said. His voice sounded rougher than his posture. I didn't want to interrupt. Miguel glanced at Calvin before replying. The look said, I can't do this with you standing in my life like this. But Calvin surprised himself. He didn't retreat. He didn't make Miguel choose between honesty and safety. Calvin lifted his chin slightly. You can talk, he said. Miguel's eyes widened a fraction, grateful and guilty at the same time. Darren swallowed. I thought you were going to meet me at the terminal entrance, he said. Miguel shook his head. I told you I'd be here, he answered. Then, without warning, Miguel's voice shifted. Less guarded, more direct. But I didn't tell you everything. Darren blinked. What do you mean? Miguel's hands tightened around his phone. He looked at Calvin again, and this time he didn't apologize for the glance. He looked as if Calvin was steady ground. I think you deserve to know who I am, Miguel said to Darren. Darren's face drained. He looked like someone had removed a chair from under him. Calvin felt himself brace. He didn't want to watch someone get hurt, but Miguel wasn't trying to hurt Darren. He was trying to stop lying. Darren's voice came out low. Are you saying... He stopped. His eyes darted to Calvin and then back to Miguel. Miguel nodded once. Calvin saw it. Darren's expression wasn't only pain. There was also anger at how long he'd let Miguel's distance feel like safety. Darren exhaled sharply. I didn't ask for this tonight, he said. Miguel's shoulders rose and fell slowly. I know, he replied. But I can't keep pretending I'm straight and you're just... a friend I owe attention to. The honesty in that sentence was a blade, but it was also a gift. It stripped away the fantasy Darren had been hiding behind. Darren's eyes glistened. You never... He swallowed. You never made me feel stupid. Miguel's voice softened. That was the point. Calvin watched Darren absorb the impact. His jaw worked as if he was trying to swallow every word he couldn't say. Finally, Darren nodded, once, small and defeated, and then he looked at Calvin. "Is this why you've been different?" Darren asked Calvin. Calvin opened his mouth, but the truth tangled. He didn't want to claim ownership over Miguel's honesty. Miguel's life wasn't a prize. Calvin chose careful truth. "I think he's been different because he's been trying to survive his own silence," Calvin said. Miguel looked at Calvin like the words had saved him. Darren stared, then let out a shaky laugh with no humor. "So it's not my fault," he murmured. "It's never anyone's fault," Miguel said, and his voice trembled now. "It's just time." Darren looked down at his hands. When he lifted his gaze again, it was calmer. Not happy, but calmer. "Okay," Darren said. "Then I'm going to be brave too." Calvin blinked. Darren surprised him. Darren straightened slightly and took a step back. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with the hurt," he admitted, "but I won't dump it on you. You're not responsible for my coping." Miguel's eyes brightened with emotion, and Calvin could tell Miguel hadn't expected generosity. It made Calvin ache. Darren continued, "I'm still your brother, friend, whatever label you want. I'm still here, but I'm not going to stand in your life pretending I don't see what you're offering." Miguel nodded, tears gathering but not falling. Darren looked at Calvin one last time. "I'm glad you're here," he said, and it sounded like a permission slip for both of them. Then Darren turned and walked away toward the restrooms, toward the side of the terminal where people pretended they weren't listening. The moment Darren left, Miguel's body seemed to collapse inward, like he'd spent everything it took to survive being honest. Calvin's heart pounded. He knew the next part would matter, how Miguel handled what came after honesty. Would he flee? Would he shame himself? Would he retreat to the numbness Calvin understood too well? Miguel sat back down slowly. He stared at his hands like he was checking whether they were still his. Calvin spoke gently. "You did something brave," he said. Miguel let out a thin laugh. "It doesn't feel brave." Calvin nodded. "It feels like fear with its teeth showing," he replied. Miguel looked at him again, and his eyes were warmer now. "I'm sorry," Miguel whispered. Calvin frowned. "For what?" Miguel's lips parted, then he swallowed. "For the chaos," he said. "For telling you the truth like it was a confession to God." Calvin shook his head. "It wasn't chaos," he said. "It was real." Miguel's breath caught. The airport announcement crackled again. This time the delay was shortened. Boarding might happen soon. People around them stirred, gathering bags, stepping closer to the gate like life was finally moving. Calvin felt his body resist the idea of leaving this quiet corner, but he wasn't ready to go back to his numb routine. Miguel looked down at Calvin's phone charger and then at his own. "You're still at 12%, he noticed. Calvin blinked. He hadn't checked. Miguel reached for his own cable, unplugging it and then plugging Calvin's phone in carefully, like he was making sure Calvin wouldn't flinch. Calvin watched the screen fill with power again. Miguel's hand lingered just slightly on the edge of Calvin's bag before pulling back. Calvin felt the lingering contact in his memory even after the hand moved away. Miguel looked at Calvin's face and spoke quietly. "Would it be okay if I stayed near you tonight?" It wasn't a romantic line. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a human request. Calvin's throat tightened. Staying near him tonight meant more waiting, more proximity, more risk. He could say no. He could retreat into the safety of distance. He could also say yes. He chose honesty. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to say yes." He paused, feeling his courage flicker like a fragile match. "But I'm scared that wanting anything will make me lose what I have left of myself." Miguel's gaze softened. "You won't lose yourself," he said, voice steady in a way that felt practiced. "But you might lose the numbness, and maybe that's the point." Calvin's breath shuddered. He didn't argue because Miguel was speaking a truth he recognized. Calvin nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "Stay." Miguel's shoulders dropped, relief and something dangerously close to hope. They sat together as the terminal finally shifted into motion. When the gate announcement started changing, Miguel helped Calvin stand, offering his arm briefly, not pulling, just making balance easier. Calvin took it. The contact was brief, but Calvin's body held onto it like it was proof that he wasn't dreaming. In the line to board, passengers shuffled forward with the desperation of people who'd been waiting too long. Calvin's head brushed Miguel's shoulder when the crowd surged. Miguel didn't move away. Instead, he angled himself, subtly creating more space while keeping contact at the same low level of closeness. It was as if Miguel understood the language Calvin couldn't speak yet. When they reached the jet bridge, the lights changed. The world felt more muted, like stepping inside a different version of night. The flight attendants checked documents. People spoke in murmurs. Calvin didn't want to think about where this would lead. He didn't want to imagine seats across an aisle or the possibility of separation. Miguel didn't ask what Calvin wanted. He just stayed beside him, a quiet constant. Later, hours later after boarding, after delays and rerouting and the strange calm of being locked together in a metal tube, Calvin found himself in an unexpected moment. They weren't close in the obvious ways. They weren't holding hands. They weren't making promises. But when the cabin lights dimmed and people settled into sleep, Calvin felt Miguel's presence like warmth near a fireplace. Calvin's head rested against the window, his gaze turned outward to the dark runway lights. His mind tried to slip into grief again. It did. Then it met something else. Miguel's breathing beside him, even in sleep, even in the quiet. A thought surfaced, slow and startling. What if wanting didn't erase love? What if it expanded it? Calvin's eyes burned. Miguel stirred in his seat, not fully waking. He turned his head slightly toward Calvin, as if sensing the shift. Calvin didn't look at him at first. He stared out at the wing. Miguel's voice came in the dark, almost too quiet. "Calvin?" Calvin swallowed. "Yeah?" Miguel paused, then spoke carefully, as if choosing words would prevent disaster. "I don't want to lie to myself anymore," he said. "I don't know what that means yet, but I know what it doesn't mean." Calvin's heart thudded. "What doesn't it mean?" Miguel's voice softened, and the words sounded like they were landing somewhere near Calvin's ribs. "It doesn't mean you're alone." Calvin froze so completely he felt like he'd stopped breathing. Miguel shifted and their knees touched under the seat, brief contact that made Calvin's whole body light up with sensation. It wasn't explicit. It wasn't a confession with physical demands. It was contact that asked for nothing except presence. Calvin's eyes closed. He felt tears slip down his face before he decided to let them. There was no dignity in it, only truth. Miguel didn't pull away. When Calvin finally turned toward him, Miguel's eyes were open in the dim cabin, watching Calvin with a tenderness that didn't pretend to fix anything. Miguel's mouth moved. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. Calvin nodded, barely. Miguel's voice shook. "I think I loved you before I knew your last name," he said. Calvin laughed once, broken and soft. "That's not fair," he whispered. Miguel flinched slightly. "I know," he said, "but it's true." Calvin stared at him in the dark and felt his own fear respond. Grief is supposed to be a wall, not a bridge. Grief is supposed to keep you faithful. But Miguel's honesty made faithfulness feel different. Not about never wanting, about wanting without lying. Calvin's voice came out with a tremor. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. Miguel's expression softened. "Neither do I," he said. "But I'm willing to learn with you." Calvin's breath caught. The flight rocked slightly as it moved through air currents, a subtle motion that made the seatbelts feel more like restraints than safety. Calvin tightened his hands in his lap. Miguel's voice was steady now. "When I told Darren I thought I'd lose him tonight," Miguel said. "But he stayed brave. He made space." Calvin nodded slowly. Miguel continued, "I think you and I need that kind of space too." Calvin's eyes stung again. He whispered, "Space to feel?" Miguel smiled faintly. "Space to be honest," he corrected. Calvin's heart broke open a little at the word honest. Honesty was what he'd denied himself, not because he didn't have feelings, but because he'd believed they would be dangerous. He'd believed love would steal something from his dead wife, something sacred. Miguel didn't steal. Miguel offered. When the plane finally landed, the cabin erupted into movement. Shoes on, bags retrieved, people speaking louder as if volume could erase the emotional residue of the flight. Calvin stayed seated a moment longer, letting the world catch up to him. Miguel waited too. He didn't rush Calvin. They found each other in the crowd the way two people find the same song on the radio after days of silence. At the gate, they paused under the fluorescent lights that made everything look sharper than it felt. Calvin's phone buzzed with messages. His body responded like a startled animal. He saw the screen, his brother-in-law's follow-up message. A reminder. Another wait. He set the phone down in his palm and looked at Miguel. "We should exchange numbers," Calvin said suddenly. Miguel blinked, surprised. "Yeah?" Calvin nodded. "But slowly," he added, because he didn't trust his own courage to not sprint. Miguel's smile trembled. "Slowly," he echoed. Their fingers brushed when they typed digits into their phones. Calvin felt the spark of it, not fireworks, but the electricity of a circuit finally completed. Outside the terminal, the air was thick with early morning heat. People moved in groups and couples and friend clusters, their closeness already decided. Calvin looked around and realized something that scared him. Love existed everywhere. It didn't require permission. It didn't ask if you were ready. Miguel stood beside him, adjusting his jacket zipper, eyes scanning the pickup area. Calvin watched him, and he saw fatigue there now, too. The honesty had cost Miguel something, but Miguel didn't look defeated. He looked alive. Calvin swallowed. "Are you going home?" he asked. Miguel's gaze returned to Calvin. "I was," he said, "but now I think I want to see where this goes." Calvin felt his heart kick. Miguel stepped closer slightly, not grabbing. "If it's okay," he added. Calvin's voice was soft. "It's okay," he said. Miguel nodded, and in that nod was an entire story being rewritten. No longer a life of numbness, no longer a careful avoidance of desire. Calvin watched Miguel's throat move as he swallowed. Miguel looked down at Calvin's hand, at the ring indentation, the ghost of a promise, and then up again. "I'm not going to replace anyone," Miguel promised quietly. Calvin's eyes widened at the gentleness of the vow. "Good," he whispered. Miguel's smile was small and sincere. "I just want to be honest about what I feel, and I want you to feel it too." Calvin's breath shook. He wanted to say something poetic, something that would make grief and desire sit peacefully beside each other. But poetry was too neat. Real feelings were messy. So Calvin chose honesty again, plain and trembling. "I think I'm ready for you," he said. Miguel's face lit with relief so vivid it nearly looked like pain. He leaned in, not to kiss yet, but to rest his forehead gently against Calvin's for a second. Enough contact to make time slow, enough restraint to keep it tender. Calvin closed his eyes. In the quiet between heartbeats, Calvin felt his grief shift, still present, still real, but no longer a prison wall. It was a room he could sit in without drowning. When Miguel pulled back, their eyes met. Miguel's voice was a whisper. "That text I sent earlier," he said. "You up?" Calvin let out a breathy laugh through tears. "You really are the type to text like that." Miguel smiled, then grew serious again. "Not like a dare," he said. "Like a question. Like I wanted to make sure you were still alive inside." Calvin's throat tightened. "I am," he said. Miguel nodded. "Then come on." Calvin didn't know exactly what "come on" meant yet. Coffee? A car ride? A date? The slow opening of a door that didn't slam shut behind them. But he knew what it meant emotionally. Miguel wasn't asking Calvin to pretend. He wasn't asking Calvin to be less honest. He was inviting Calvin into something real. Calvin took Miguel's hand, this time without hesitation, and their fingers laced carefully, like both of them were learning the shape of hope. As they walked toward the rideshare pickup, the terminal lights reflected off the windows behind them. Calvin looked back once. Not longing, not regret, just gratitude. For the delay, for the conversation that wasn't planned, for the courage it took to tell the truth in a place that could have swallowed it. And for the first moment, small, trembling, and profoundly human, when Calvin realized he didn't have to stop loving to start living again.